Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought I might share a few decks that are close to my heart for one reason or another. I was reorganizing my collection, trying to decide if there were any that needed to go and where to put certain decks, and I realized that I made a little pile of ones that I have a sentimental attachment to or feel quite strongly about for one reason or another. And I thought I would share them because on this tarot side of YouTube, there's nothing that we like more than watching people share their decks and sharing our own decks. So figured couldn't go wrong with this one. I'm sure there are probably, or is probably already a tag that is along these lines. Just knowing that there's probably a tag at this point for any and everything that somebody could think of. So if it's already been done, I apologize, but just thought I might share. In a sort of chronological order, a few decks of mine that hold a sort of nostalgic value, that have a special place in my heart, that I probably will never get rid of for reasons outside of what they actually are. So the connection to these decks goes beyond the physical imagery, it goes beyond the actual use and utility and practical purposes of the deck. It's more about the memories or some sort of emotion that I associate with the specific item itself. So this isn't just any old Waite Smith, as you may have guessed, and if you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that this is actually my very first deck ever. I got it when I was about 17 or 18 years old, I can't quite remember, when I was just starting college in New York City, and it was sort of a random find, and I do happen to still have my very original Waite Smith deck. It's been through a lot, it's been through the ups and downs, it's still in great condition, and it is that more gaudy plaid back version, which I don't mind the colors, which I know many people find to be garish. I think it's great, and it was really the only deck that I had for the first, I want to say 3, maybe more years of my tarot time and learning, so I didn't collect the first couple of years. It was on and off the shelf. It went through many fun readings where I was referencing a book with my roommate and friends on my floor. There were plenty of drunk tarot readings in my dorm room, and just fun occasions where I would bring it to a coffee shop and just have a look through it. These actually functioned a lot like flashcards for me in my early days, where I would reference the images and the symbolisms and then just kind of recite or list off as many known associations and correspondences as I could remember from my one little book until I had it memorized front to back. And it was from that point that I started to actually get a handle on the memorization of the cards. Then I could go deeper and start to derive my own meanings, and it took on a life of its own. In teaching tarot classes in the past 2 or 3 years, I do get a lot of questions about how you go about memorizing the cards, how do you end up learning them all, and there isn't really a good answer for that other than actual study and practice, which I know nobody wants to hear. I know putting in the work is never the fun part, and that's the reason I think a lot of people that do go to learn tarot don't end up lasting very long. You really have to want it, and you do have to push through that beginning stage where you do learn the structure and you do learn the meanings before you get to the fun stuff. And of course, you can do the fun stuff along the way. You can totally disregard any meanings that you begin with the tarot deck or that are commonly associated with the cards. But I do think as students of the tarot, it behooves us to at least know those things, whether or not we choose to use them in our tarot readings or tarot practice then remains to be seen. So my very first deck, I'll try to hold on to it for my entire life if possible. I love it, even though I don't work with the Waite Smith, or rarely work with the Waite Smith in terms of myself and clients, although I will use it for teaching purposes, and I do refer back to it, and this is definitely my sort of ingrained mental image of what every card is. Next, in chronological order, we've got the Wildwood Tarot, actually, which I keep in this pouch. This was the second deck I acquired in my tarot journey, so about 3.5, maybe almost 4 years deep into my tarot studies, I picked up a copy of the Wildwood as my second deck. I didn't know which one to go for. I didn't know about the whole tarot world. I hadn't even been on YouTube yet in any capacity and watched other people share decks or talk about tarot in any way. And I just discovered that there was a bunch on Amazon. I didn't know that indie decks existed. I didn't even know that many tarot decks existed. So I stumbled upon this one. There was a handful that I looked at, and I thought that this was really interesting. It was at the start of my sort of magical renewal, my spiritual renewal in life, and there was definitely a sort of, I would say, twinge or pinch of Celtic spirituality woven into that, so this seemed right. It was also my first experience working with a deck that didn't quite fit the Waite Smith system. This isn't what I would consider a Waite Smith clone. It follows more so the Wheel of the Year, although there are parallels that can be drawn. I would say seeing, for example, court cards where an animal showed the idea of the court card was very new to me. A lot of these images didn't necessarily align with the way I thought of the cards, and so it definitely changed my perspective. I will say that I wound up not using it nearly as much as I thought I would, and it wasn't one that turned into this like long-term favorite that I had a really insightful experience with. It's one that I occasionally used, and I would credit it with changing my perspective and broadening my tarot horizons, and a little bit like a gateway deck into the collecting aspect, but it isn't one that I necessarily think I ever had a long span using or enjoying, but it's nostalgic for that fact that it did sort of open up the door into the tarot world for me. I have edged my original copy in purple, something that I sometimes regret. It did bleed onto the white fronts. The card quality, as many know with the Wildwood, is not the best, so I don't really like the backs that have the writing on them. They don't shuffle very well at all. Bridge and ruffle shuffle doesn't really work very well with these guys. So yeah, but it will always have a place in my heart as that sort of second tarot deck. This one definitely was the key or the door opener into the tarot world, and it started me down a path that I am still on to this day, so I have to thank it for that at least. Alright, so the third deck in my tarot journey that I still cherish very dearly to this day is this copy of the Fountain Tarot. I know that this is one that many of us have loved at some point or another. It took the tarot community by storm and had its rightful 15 minutes of fame, probably more actually, and I know many of us to this day are still quite enamored with it. And I particularly love this copy because it was the first tarot deck that I was ever gifted or given by somebody else. This was, I believe, my third tarot deck, and my first two I purchased myself. Most of my decks I have purchased myself, so any deck that's been given to me by somebody else, specifically anybody that I care about, means quite a bit to me. And gifts in general, things given by others with intention or care or love, are so meaningful. I tend to hold on to things that others have given to me. I keep a memory box. I hold on to things. I don't like to get rid of them, especially when they've been given to me with some sort of intention or with a reasoning behind it that's super meaningful. So those things matter to me, and I guess I hadn't ever heard of that myth that you need to be given a tarot deck or gifted a tarot deck for it to be valid. And I remember hearing that many years into my tarot journey, specifically when I went to teach a tarot class. The woman who reached out to ask me to co-teach with her, I guess, believed in that to some regard and included in the cost of the class the amount that it would take for us to buy the decks for the students, so that way it would be in alignment with that myth. And I'm really not sure where that stems from. I'd love to know. I think that that's kind of silly, if you ask me. It definitely makes it a little bit more of, if anything, it sounds kind of gatekeeping. It seems like a gatekeeping practice in that, if you don't have anybody to sort of hand something down to you or gift it to you, that you might not be able to participate in the practice itself. And I don't like that. So, but it's an interesting myth, and in this regard, it was the first one, a little bit of a tangent, the first one that I'd been gifted or given by anybody else, and so I'll always hold on to it. Next up in my tarot journey, I believe we would reach the Thoth. Specifically, I know I have a few different Thoth decks. I have my one greenie that I probably use a lot more. This is definitely an edition or a copy of the Thoth that I find myself not using nearly as much these days. However, I'll never get rid of it. It was my first, it was the one that I learned on, it was the one that I studied, it helped me to fall in love with the system, and I think that my tarot practice in some ways was either a bit asleep or boring until the Thoth fully entered the picture. It really enlivened me, it opened my eyes, it's just, I didn't know that I was asleep until the Thoth woke me up. So this is the deck that did that for me. I took the time to trim it. It's the only deck that I've ever trimmed, and I spent so much time doing that. I made a whole video on it. I edged it as well. I've only edged a handful of decks in my collection. It turned out great. It still riffle shuffles amazingly. The cards are super uniform in size, so I'm proud of that, and it was a labor of love for sure. So this edition is super colorful and borderless, and after kind of taking the larger size and trimming off the borders, it's now more of a traditional tarot size, or Waite Smith, very like US game size card on that traditional style that we have all come to know. And it's great for this. I use this one mostly when I'm out and about and I need a deck that is going to be fine to just throw in my bag and not have to worry about it. There's also my other greenie, which is a little bit damaged, so I don't mind like throwing it in my bag as well. But this one, if I'm really going anywhere, I don't mind using this outdoors. I don't mind just putting this on a table or any other place and letting others touch it. So yeah, it's definitely one that will stay with me forever and has already stood the test of time and will continue to do so with years of love to come. The next two tarot decks are gifts from people that, of course, that's what's making them sentimental to me. So next we have another version of the Thoth. I think I've shared this one a few times, or on camera have shared it before. It's in this lovely pouch. This is actually from our very lovely Hanny from Fierce and Pretty, and this was probably one of the kindest gifts I'd ever received. I remember just getting so emotional when this arrived with a letter from her. This pouch itself is so nice. It's from, I believe, the shop is Hex Couture, and I think that bag designer or tarot deck pouch designer is actually based in Finland, so that is just a really funny coincidence. And I'll never be able to use this deck and not think of Hanny. It's a special edition of the Thoth, a sort of reprinting where the original images were rescanned with more updated technology. And Hanny, as a fellow tarot nerd and Thoth lover, of course knows the value that having a sort of different quality of image has on the cards. As collectors, when we look, for example, for those greenies or those different editions where the cards just look different, I personally love these backs a lot more. This would be probably equivalent to the smaller size Thoth. I think that golden border is a lot less obtrusive and just more, it's more fitting with the deck than the white, the really stark white, which is, I know, an eyesore for a lot of people, myself included. So I think that this fits a lot better. I think the backs on this are just prettier, and it sort of has a goldish caramel look to it. These are the fronts. These cards are in Finnish, which I actually love. I think it's great. And of course, I know the cards well enough that it doesn't matter. I don't need the titles, or I don't really need anything written on them, especially where it comes to the minors and we have those titles. I wouldn't call them keywords, I'd call them titles. But yeah, this deck is lovely. Of course, the image quality and the colors are going to be different because it's been rescanned from the originals with sort of new and updated technology, which I think is great. And I would have never have purchased or heard of or maybe even had access to this deck if it weren't for Hanny. I believe it's a little bit of a limited print running, and it means so much that she thought of me and went out of her way to get me this deck along with a pouch that's fitting with my brand, Lemniscate Logic. And it's just one of the best gifts I've ever been given. I am emotional talking about it right now. I'll never get rid of it. And I use it for really serious matters in my life. When I'm making major decisions, I tend to actually use this specific edition of the Thoth, and I usually end up sending Hanny a message telling her that I've used it or that I am using it, and I do reserve it for those really special occasions. I would say that with all of the decks that I've shared, my sentimental decks, they're not decks that I use every day, and some of them I wouldn't even consider my favorites, although this I would definitely consider a favorite. But for example, the Wildwood, the Fountain, and even the Waite Smith, I don't use those decks often, and I wouldn't consider them favorites, but I'll never get rid of them, and they do have certain places and times where I will use them very, in a sort of very purposeful way. And one of the biggest purposes for this one in my collection is for very serious, deep readings. Finally, there aren't too many sentimental decks in my collection, so I only have about 6 that I personally was categorizing as sentimental. We have this one, and this is one I don't think I have ever shared. This is, oh, I just moved that. This is a version of the Marseille. This is actually by our very own Justin. I know he has gotten into card making and is pretty knowledgeable on the process of card making and history, and I definitely recommend checking out his channel. He has great work, and I remember he had reached out to me when he was printing cards and just really getting into the process of the different inks and stocks and the history and all that stuff that's super complicated. He took the time to reach out and offered to send me a copy that he'd made. This is just so freaking special. It's very traditional in that it's on that sort of very linen-y, papery cardstock that's not super laminated. They're not all uniform in size, and they have those sharp corners. That's very historically accurate, really, in my opinion. This is generally how we would see those older styles of deck, or more classical Marseilles and older styles of tarot decks. And something about it, the coloring, the sort of non-uniform cards and coloring, it just makes it extra special and handmade, and I will forever cherish this. It's always out on my table along with Hanny's deck. Hanny's being one that I use a lot for serious readings. I actually find that I use this one a lot for the imagery and for study, just because it does feel like I'm holding a piece of history. Somebody who, like Justin, was willing to go in and learn the card making process and take the time to experiment with the paper and the inks and the printing and all that stuff that's not easy at all. I couldn't tell you the first thing about how it's actually done, but I know that it came out wonderfully and beautifully, and it just means so much that somebody else in the community would think of me in such a way, and that I have friends and community members that I'm close enough in this way to, interact and for us to think of each other. It was just such a wonderful gift, one of the best gifts I've ever been given as well, and another one that just definitely makes me emotional, and the last 2 definitely have me reflecting on my time and my time in the tarot community and what it's all meant, and the people and bonds and friendships that I've forged over the years. It's crazy to think that I've been creating videos or been in this space for about 3 years or so now, maybe. It's 3 years. It's just wild. This has definitely been a little bit of a trip down memory lane for me, and I hope it was just fun and interesting. If this tag hasn't been done, or even if it has, feel free to respond, and I would love to see some decks in your collection that hold that really deep value for you for one reason or another, and I'd love to know a little bit of the story behind where that value comes from and why you cherish them so dearly. But until next time, well wishes, like and subscribe if this was fun and interesting, and goodbye.